Good morning, everyone. I apologize that I speak Italian very well, but Spanish not so well, and I'm afraid if I tried my Spanish, I would lapse into ordering something from a fancy trattoria in Rome, so I will avoid that. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody here for coming and to thank everyone from the university for inviting us. I think we all feel very honored to be part of this first conference, and we wish that, and we hope that this will be the first of many, many more successful conferences that we'll be able to attend in the audience, perhaps the next time. So I want to begin my remarks today with a question for all of you. Can any of you think of an industry or business that looks just like it did 15 or 20 years ago, when technology was far more unreliable, when it was so much slower, and so much more expensive? Automobiles, for example, are completely different, right? Most new cars have airbags, internal guidance systems, cameras, lane assistance warnings, and other features that would have been inconceivable in 1995. Agriculture is another example. It's vastly more efficient thanks to genetically modified foods, new fertilizers and pesticides, better computer modeling to determine which crops can thrive amid climate change, and so on. Still, for all these other changes, I think some of the biggest transformations, thanks to technology, have occurred in the field I work in, which is journalism. In many ways, the news business is more robust and interesting than it was 20 years ago. Think about how we access news. Any of us can pull out our phones or tablets or laptops right now and click on stories that were generated from Santiago, Chile, Calgary, Canada, or Johannesburg, South Africa. And I suspect if I don't hold your interest, some of you might start doing that shortly. Similarly, journalists can produce stories, whether in words or video or data, more quickly, more vividly, and with greater audience and engagement than ever before. Meanwhile, the cost of doing journalism has fallen rapidly thanks to digital formats that enable us to publish our stories much more cheaply than we used to in the years past. In the old days, news appeared only in expensive print editions that required massive capital investment or broadcast systems that were heavily regulated by government. So if you're a journalist, this is all for the good, yes? We have lower costs, better distribution, more understanding of our audience, and greater access. It seems like this is what business people often call a win-win. Unfortunately, despite all those good omens, the news business is generating a lot of bad news these days. Our business models are under tremendous pressure thanks to a loss of print and broadcast advertising. Our distribution models are in trouble as companies like Facebook and Twitter increasingly become the go-to place for many of our readers and viewers, meaning that we often lose some of the tight bonds with our readers that were both profitable and useful. The result around the world is that most news organizations must cope with smaller reporting staffs, tighter budgets, and more confusion about our audience in terms of where true and verified information is coming from. In the United States, newsroom employment has dropped, or newspaper employment has dropped to about 35,000 in 2015 from 55,000 10 years ago. Now, there are many new jobs in new digital news organizations and startups, but those only partly mitigate the losses from traditional media. Now, I could give an entire speech about the problems and opportunities facing the news business, but that's not my topic today. I want to talk, especially since I'm with such esteemed professors and academic administrators, about how this tectonic and ongoing transformation is playing out in journalism education, particularly at the program where I was academic dean for 6 years and now am a faculty member, the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York City. For reasons I will discuss in a moment, I think this is an important topic for any academic, including those of you who will never set foot in a newsroom or a journalism classroom. Almost every subject that universities teach, architecture, medicine, law, or business, just to name a few, is undergoing a massive change thanks to technology. Some are changing faster than others, and I'd argue that journalism is among the most effective for now. But no matter what you teach or where you teach it, you must be ready to transform your curriculum and methods to ensure that your students graduate with the skills and understanding necessary for a lifetime of change. So I want to begin with a little background about journalism education, the Columbia Journalism School, and my own personal story about how I wound up in academia. Columbia School has been around for about 100 years and is one of the oldest in the United States. It was founded by Joseph Pulitzer, a Hungarian immigrant to the U.S., who became one of the leading editors of his time. It is the only journalism program in the Ivy League, and it's important to keep in mind that for most of its existence, it is operated as a graduate school, meaning we accept students only after they've completed an undergraduate degree somewhere in the world. Many students come to Columbia after they've gotten not just a degree, but have also spent a few years doing journalism, usually for a small newspaper, TV station, or website. I'll just let him fix that. Thank you. That'll be fine. So this distinguishes Columbia from many programs, which are designed for undergraduates who often sample a few journalism classes and then eventually decide to major in something altogether different, like history or economics. That's fine. You can just leave it there. Yeah. Thank you. Columbia Journalism School is not housed, as many journalism programs are, in a large communications department. In those programs, journalism faculty sit with, work with, and often compete with professors who teach subjects like public relations or advertising. At Columbia, we do none of that. Every student who comes to Columbia Journalism School has decided this is going to be her or his career path. And just about every person on the faculty is a practitioner of journalism. Our students take on a lot to come to Columbia. Even though the program is just 10 months long, the tuition is around $60,000. Now, we do offer many scholarships, and we help arrange for other financial aid to make it affordable for most students. Still, we recognize it represents a significant commitment in time and money, and the school is sensitive about our responsibility to ensure that our students graduate with the knowledge, skills, and ethics that they'll need to pursue this career. Now, the last few years, journalism education has gotten a dubious reputation in some circles. Some question the value of a journalism degree given the disruption and uncertainty in the business. Understandably, we hear this question a lot from prospective students and their parents. In fact, in many countries, including the United States, you don't need a journalism degree to become a reporter. Journalism isn't a profession in the United States like medicine or law, where a licensing board can determine who practices and who doesn't. Indeed, anybody with a laptop, smartphone, or a photocopier can start doing journalism within minutes. And there are certain skills that good journalists must possess that we simply can't teach, things like curiosity, intelligence, and empathy. But there's a great deal that can be taught and learned in journalism school. How to get people to talk, how to verify information, how to distinguish a great story from a good one, how to use digital tools to create and distribute journalism, how to avoid getting sued, or how to defend yourself if that does happen. We can also teach young journalists how to stay safe in conflict zones, or how to keep working in countries where elected officials have little respect for press freedom. Now, I personally didn't go to journalism school. Neither did the current dean at Columbia or his predecessor. The truth is, when we were starting our careers in the 1970s and 1980s, most newsrooms had many senior editors who would teach young journalists the basics and make sure that we didn't make any terribly embarrassing mistakes. They could also help us understand how to shape our coverage of difficult and complex stories. Some newsrooms still have such editors, but that's becoming more and more rare. If you're a newsroom executive who's been told to make some personnel cuts, the editing desk is often the first place where they make the cuts. A news organization can trim editors before it lays off the reporters. So that means that most young journalists don't have the same opportunity to learn on the job as they used to when I got in the business. It doesn't mean the journalists don't need to know those things, it just means that they're not as likely to learn them from an experienced editor or manager. In fact, I would argue there's a lot more that young journalists should know than when I started. The only technological skill I needed in the 1970s was the ability to type 25 to 30 words a minute. But now if you're entering journalism and don't know how to use a digital camera to illustrate your stories, or an audio recorder to give voice to your subjects, or Twitter to distribute your journalism, or digital tools to publish it, you're at a major disadvantage. And the journalist career path is very different. Many young reporters will never work in a traditional newsroom. They may start their own blog or news organization, but that means that they're even more on their own. Which brings us to another reason for journalism education. I screwed up a few stories when I was a young reporter, but there's almost no way for anyone to find them because they appeared in newspapers decades ago, and now are locked away in the microfiche stacks of libraries, or they lie at the bottom of a landfill in North Dakota or Florida. But the consequences for messing up a story now are far more serious than they used to be. If a journalist makes a bad mistake, it becomes part of his or her digital trail, not just for the few weeks after the story was published, but available via a Google search for decades to come. And while a journalism degree won't prevent a reporter from ever making a mistake, it will give them the knowledge and understanding they need to avoid making the worst ones. With that in mind, it's also clear the school where I teach occupies an unusual and not altogether comfortable place at Columbia University, which is a large research university tethered to many of the traditional norms of American academia. My school's goal is to train students for a profession, and most of our faculty don't do traditional academic research. They do journalism. Our faculty would be more likely to have their work appear on BBC or National Public Radio or the Atlantic magazine than in an academic journal devoted to communication studies. Many of our professors do research on topics like crime, poverty, international affairs, or economics, rather than seeking out new trends in communication theory. That sets us apart from many departments at Columbia, and it creates oftentimes confusion in our dealings with the university. But this attention to the practice of journalism is an essential factor in maintaining our reputation among students and news organizations around the world, and was fundamental to our decision to revamp the program a few years ago. As for me, I came to academia in an unusual way. I worked at a number of newspapers, starting with a daily in Rome, Italy, and a weekly that I founded on an Indian reservation in the United States. After editing newspapers in Florida, I arrived at the Wall Street Journal, where I oversaw staffs writing stories for the front page and eventually the digital version of the newspaper. It was that combination of print and digital experience that got me to Columbia, and it was with that perspective that I began work as the academic dean, overseeing the faculty and curriculum. I started at a daunting time, in the fall of 2008. Just as the stock market crashed, millions of people lost their jobs or lost their homes. This was the depth of the financial crisis in the U.S., and it was clear that news organizations, which depend heavily on advertising and consumer spending, were going to be in for a rough time. It wasn't long before many reporters and editors would lose their jobs, and before some journalism companies faced the prospect of going out of business. But amid the financial crisis, something else was happening too. Apple had just introduced the iPhone. Wireless internet connectivity was becoming cheap and prevalent. And the news business was, even for all its problems, was responding with innovative ways of updating stories, podcasts, and videos, all of which were transmitted digitally. Many of our more traditional customers were abandoning print newspapers and magazines or evening news broadcasts and going online. So amid all the financial chaos, the pace of digital change was speeding up, not slowing down. That's the point at which, along with several of my faculty colleagues, we started to examine the way Columbia journalism was teaching its students at the beginning of the 21st century. There was much good there, but there were also some significant problems. Let's start with the good things. The journalism school has always put great emphasis on the quality of the classroom experience. Professors are expected to spend a lot of time coaching and editing students. Most classes have only 12 to 15 students, and we don't rely much on Ph.D. students or teaching assistants to oversee our student work. The school believes firmly in the motto of learning by doing. Most of the students' time is spent on the streets and in homes, churches and stores of New York City, where they interview residents, research trends, seek out experts, and report, write, and produce compelling stories about topics like politics, crime, and business. Maybe it's my speech. It seems to make the microphone go down. So, when the microphone hits the floor, I'll stop talking. Our students go into neighborhoods that, for many of them, are unlike any place they've visited before. We seek to take advantage of the city's rich diversity and complex array of strengths and problems so our students will do ambitious, meaningful journalism. Now, the school did respond to one problem, which a number of years before I got there, the fact that it wasn't academically inclined enough. We created a Master of Arts program that enabled students to do a deep dive in topics like arts or politics or science. Still, the basic curriculum at the journalism school, the Master of Science program, hadn't changed much in the last 30 years, even though the world and the news business had changed a great deal. Mostly, the change consisted of a smattering of what we then called new media classes. That is, classes that help students understand a few basics around building a website or live blogging a breaking news story. All the students were expected to be able to demonstrate basic proficiency with the digital camera and to be able to conduct and edit short audio interviews. But all in all, in 2009, students at Columbia learned journalism much the way they had in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Now, what do I mean by this? There was one really big problem. Our curriculum mapped closely onto traditional, and were already by then increasingly outdated silos in the news business. Students had to choose and concentrate their studies in one of four fields: newspapers, magazines, broadcast, or new media. That's the way we defined our studies because that's the way the business used to be defined. Now, many years ago, those concentrations made sense. If you worked in a newspaper, you most likely wrote or edited stories. If you worked at a magazine, you also used a pen and paper or a computer, but you just had a different style or focus than a newspaper reporter. If you worked at a print publication, you would never in a million years be expected to produce video the way TV correspondents do or audio programs. But by the 21st century, those neat and tidy boundaries were dissipating and fast as digital technologies and audiences expanded. Some of the biggest TV broadcast companies in the United States and beyond started building websites and phone apps that required journalists who could write on deadline. It wasn't actually important if you were at abc.com that you could do a video. They wanted you to have the same skills a traditional newspaper reporter did. Meanwhile, at newspapers, they were starting to post audio and video on their websites, and the traditional print skill set no longer sufficed for many of them. And everywhere, TV, radio, newspapers or magazines, news organizations were trying to understand all the new real-time data they were getting about their audience. Who was clicking on what story, where those users were coming from. So they wanted journalists who understood web traffic and could translate that into more readers and viewers and more ad revenue. Meanwhile, at Columbia, we were teaching our students in a way that adhered to a failing business model. Much of our curriculum was tied up with a course that dated back to the 1960s called Reporting and Writing 1, or RW1, as it was often called. This class took up the entire first semester for students, or about half their time at the journalism school. There was much to commend about this class, as hundreds of alumni will attest. Students got close attention from experienced journalists to learn how to report and write a story. A few classes added some instruction in video or investigative skills, and everyone was expected, encouraged, and sometimes forced to report from neighborhoods or about topics that were outside their traditional comfort zones. But these RW1 classes, the ones that took up a full 50% of the students' time at Columbia, were getting outdated. They often felt more like a boot camp for a faltering part of the business, with little recognition of how much digital technology had changed reporting and writing. They adhered closely to the student concentrations, which those students had chosen a year before they even arrived at Columbia. And if any student began to hesitate about specializing in newspaper journalism rather than new media, Our response was basically, tough luck. That's what you signed up for. So think about it. Columbia University, with one of the most prestigious journalism programs in the world, was offering students an expensive degree that was becoming less and less applicable to the unfolding world of digital news. This couldn't last. But it wasn't going to be easy to change for a few reasons that many of you will appreciate. First, as you know, academics pride themselves on a long-term view. Universities which have been around for decades, or in Columbia's case, more than 2 or 3 centuries, see progress as a slow, contemplative process, one not subject to the whims of the moment. Quick pivots in curriculum or teaching methods are uncommon and are difficult to pull off. This slow pace is seen, rightly, as a virtue, as it ensures the academy will teach eternal essential truths and values and will avoid the vagaries of trends that come and go. We face this sentiment, partly from some members of our faculty and much more fundamentally from some members of the university administration when we contemplated changing the curriculum. Second, the truth is when faculty come to a place like Columbia, they don't want to leave. Many of them have lifetime employment guarantees, known as tenure, and the life of a Columbia professor is a good one. The university offers excellent benefits. We have wonderfully talented students who are eager to learn, and we get summers off so we can come to Ecuador. As a result, some faculty feel little incentive to learn new skills or develop new talents, even if some of what they've been teaching for years has become outdated. Finally, there are good reasons why many core elements of a journalism education should remain constant. For every new development in video or data visualization, there is some other core value or skill that remains as important and needed as ever. A young journalist still must understand the ethical implication of giving off-the-record status to a confidential source. Libel laws still influence the way journalists practice their craft. Treating the people you cover with empathy is still vital, no matter what format you use. In fact, some of the changes brought by digital technology increase the need for training in essential value and ethics. Columbia and other top schools have long stressed that journalists must verify information, must not simply parrot or repeat news from press releases or official statements. In the digital world, we journalists increasingly depend upon citizens armed with mobile phones to capture video or report news about events ranging from earthquakes to assassinations. But sometimes those so-called citizen journalists post false information or unconfirmed rumors, and 21st century reporters need to be able to distinguish between what's fake and what's true. So it's more important than ever that journalism schools lead the way in teaching those values. Indeed, the one thing we hear consistently from news organizations that hire our students is that they want graduates who can distinguish fact from fiction, who have the ability to critically analyze information coming from disparate sources, and who can tell a story with a narrative arc and with enough detail and color that readers, viewers, and listeners will remain engaged even if the subject isn't of immediate interest. So that's the dilemma we faced a few years ago. How do you bring the next generation of journalists up to speed in essential skills and values, and at the same time prepare them for the changes that digital technology has brought? The problem isn't just Columbia's. Many schools face this. Some schools didn't survive that process. At several prestigious public universities in the United States, including the University of Colorado and the University of Indiana, journalism schools were folded into larger communications departments. Various reasons were given. Student enrollment was dropping, or such a practical course of study made an awkward fit in an academic environment, but that's the reality. We were never worried that Columbia would do that to our journalism school. The president of Columbia, Lee Bollinger, is a staunch advocate of press freedom, and he's been a reliable supporter of our program. But we also knew that for our own future, if we wanted to continue to attract talented students, we had to take a tough look at our curriculum. Fortunately, I'd been working in the journalism industry for 30 years, so I still had many contacts in the industry. And I realized this was my most important responsibility. I kept an open door to students and alumni, and I heard a lot of complaints and compliments about the program. So the first thing that became clear when we started this process was we needed to move away from our reliance on those concentrations in newspaper, broadcast, digital, and magazines. Our system no longer reflected the changing journalism environment. This is harder than it might seem. So much of our hiring, course selection, and programming was built around those concentrations. If we were going to remove them, we would need to rethink the entire program. To fail to do that would be like removing the lobby from this hotel and thinking that all the guest rooms would stay intact. This was daunting, but it was also exciting. I knew that many other faculty shared these concerns, and I also felt that we could explain how this one change would require and enable us to transform everything else. So that's how we started the conversation. What would our curriculum look like if we removed the concentrations? The ideas came spilling out. Add data skills to the curriculum, some faculty suggested. Make sure everyone knows how to use a video camera, others offered. What about social media? Doesn't everyone need to know how to use Twitter or Facebook to get distribution for their stories? Do you want me to stop for a moment? Okay. Thank you. Is that on? Okay. And let's be sure our students, oh, that is different. Do you want me to start over again? Just kidding. Let's be sure our students still know how to write a story, everybody agreed. And don't forget the classes that we have to teach to keep our accreditation, core classes in things like the law, ethics, and history of journalism. So over a period of weeks, we came up with an entirely new structure for Columbia's curriculum. We did remove the concentrations, and then we created a slew of new classes. The first and biggest change was our class in basic reporting methods. We wanted to be far less of a boot camp and more of a way for students to thoughtfully examine how to focus on questions like these. How do you interview somebody that you've never met? How do you incorporate expert research to make your stories more credible? How do you find fresh angles to such well-known topics as housing shortages or drug use or income inequality? And while we didn't eliminate entirely the production part of journalism during this class, we really focused on how to report. We used this initial 7-week class to teach every student the essentials of finding and reporting stories without rigid adherence to the 20th century newspaper model. Moreover, because reporting is so essential, we made this new class virtually the students' only responsibility for their first few months at Columbia. We followed that with 2 other classes in the second half. One is on writing, because no matter what technology you use to do journalism, the ability to write a coherent, compelling story is essential. And we asked them each to take a class in what we call image and sound, basic building block classes where students can choose to learn to do video, data, or audio. And finally, they would begin work on their master's project, a long-form piece of journalism that would be reported and written during 6 of the 10 months that they're at Columbia. In the spring semester, the students would finish their master's projects and do 2 deep dive seminars in topics of their choice, ranging from environmental journalism to data visualization. And they'd take a new class in what we call audience and engagement, learning how to deal with social media like Facebook and Twitter, and learning how journalists must engage with their viewers and readers. That was the plan. But deans cannot impose such broad changes by fiat. It required a vote of the faculty, and that's entirely appropriate, given the professors are the ones teaching those new classes. So we spent several months explaining these changes to faculty, adapting the curriculum to some of their needs, and ensuring that we would keep it relevant and flexible. We also brought in alumni, students, and managers at major news organizations to ensure that we were on track. In the end, the faculty took a vote. The vote was 34-0 to approve the changes. There was one professor who was unhappy with some of the changes who abstained. From there, it took a little over a year to fully implement the new curriculum. We tested a few of the new classes on certain student groups, and that enabled us to tweak and adjust the coursework before we rolled it out for everyone. It's hard to describe how fundamentally different this new approach was from the old one. We eliminated concentrations, we replaced the 1960s foundational course with new classes more adaptive to digital. We developed classes that reflected changing audience models and means of producing and distributing journalism in a connected world. And now, 3 years later, I'm happy to say that overall the curriculum did most of what we had hoped. It's more flexible, more attuned to changes in the industry, and more appealing to broader numbers of prospective students. At the same time, we continue to stress the most important values of journalism: accuracy and fairness, treating sources and readers with respect for their time and their intelligence. Not every class has gone as planned. Audience engagement is a challenge, especially as students get overloaded with their master's projects. So we're incorporating some of that into other classes and adding a new class on investigative research methods this fall. As for me, I stepped down as a dean the year after we implemented this program, but I remain a Columbia professor and also work at Bloomberg News. So I can concentrate on things I hope to accomplish in the rest of my career. So what do we make of all this? It might be tempting to see this as purely a matter of changing one program at one university. After all, what does journalism have to do with anthropology or medicine or architecture or statistics? But as I said at the beginning, there are very few parts of our lives that haven't been changed by technology. And I think this experience at Columbia Journalism School is being replicated in other parts of our university, and appropriately so. The impact of digital technology and platforms on curriculum is profound and widespread, and I suggest that all of you, if you haven't already, will need to consider how and when, not if, you'll need to look at your programs in this light. Take, for example, the field of the classical studies, which is what I majored in at Stanford University in the 1970s. My course of study wasn't that different from the way classics have been taught for centuries. We spent the initial phase of the program learning basic Latin and Greek vocabulary and grammar. And then we hunkered down over texts of Aristotle, Virgil, and Homer as we built language expertise. We spent many hours in small classrooms going line by line through Plato's Republic or Sophocles' Antigone. Some of us had the opportunity to study in Rome or Athens for a few months to gain a deeper appreciation of ancient history, literature, and archaeology. But if you look at many classical studies programs now, that course of study is almost unrecognizable. Scholars of Roman archaeology, for example, now use detailed digital mapping technologies to understand the paths of aqueducts that brought fresh water to the city's growing masses, or the road system that fueled the empire's economic and political growth. Digital changes are even more significant in classics when it comes to understanding ancient history and texts. Thanks to digital search and textual analysis, students and scholars can investigate hitherto unknown patterns in grammar, syntax, meter, and word usage. With a few clicks on a computer, you can seek out pretty much any term or phrase that appeared in the canon of Greek or Roman literature or history and find its origin, usage, and other critical elements. So in that light, how should a classics department be training students who hope to become scholars? Should they, like I did, spend all their time reading ancient texts? Shouldn't they also be taking classes in the computer science department, where they can learn programming skills that will help them parse Greek plays and speeches, or understand the demographics of ancient societies, or map migrations of tribes and peoples as empires rose and fell? That, I think, is a challenge and opportunity for all of us in academia. The fields we train our students for are changing, and they require us to adapt as well. I realize that each field of study and each university has its own methods and standards, its own culture and history. I do not for a moment claim that any of you should try to mimic too closely what we did at Columbia Journalism School a few years ago. I do think, though, that new technologies require each of us to instill our faculty and programs with less resistance to change, more openness to doing more substantive digital adaptation than simply putting syllabi online or incorporating a few digital tools in the classroom. We need to fundamentally rethink what we teach and how we teach it. That doesn't mean that we abandon vital values or skills. Just as the journalism school continues to teach young reporters how to deal responsibly and ethically with difficult situations, so all programs must distill the most valuable lessons to impart. But if we've learned anything, it's this: technological change will neither cease nor slow. The impact of digital communication and tools will only increase in the years to come. It is both our challenge and our great good luck that we are in this period ourselves, that we get to push ourselves and our colleagues and our students to embrace this transformation. Thank you very much.